Hello, all. I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you today, but thank you to Stephanie for organizing this. And I wish I were here to enjoy the conversations with you. And I hope you're having a good conference. My name is Sonya Huber. I'm so grateful to Stephanie for organizing this panel and for a chance to explore questions that have been at the center of my writing, activism, and teaching. I'm going to talk about voice, about who we are and all the options we have inside of us and how that connects to disability. After I developed rheumatoid arthritis in 2009, I found myself with a writing challenge. My entire way of thinking and therefore writing felt submerged in a vat of molasses. I'd been used to pouring coffee in my skull and attacking the keyboard. And now I was navigating through chronic pain, which seemed to slow down my thoughts as my nervous system struggled to adapt to all the signals that were barraging it. Rather than creating long, complex sentences and feeling like I was a brain in a jar, I'd become most definitely a barraged body mind trying to write. Even the urgent questions in my life had changed, and the most urgent question of all was how I was going to live and continue writing with this pain. The stress that surrounded a sudden disability, including trying to figure out how to continue working and supporting my 5-year-old son and myself, added a thick layer of anxiety onto this challenge. I needed to also continue writing for my sanity, but I reverted to my earliest writing process of accumulating phrases, this time about the pain. I leaned heavily into weather metaphors because that's how I explained this new weirdness to myself as inside weather. I cried a lot. I knew writing was a way forward, and as I started to read the wise words of others to develop a basic understanding of disability politics and my own ableism, I decided, as any essayist or memoirist knows, to take notes on this developing catastrophe, because any shitty experience at least gives us material. I decided that I was doing field work. So, in taking notes about what it was like, I observed that this new feeling of writing was different. Slower, but also more direct and unstoppable. I accumulated metaphors, and I learned that on days when my pain was bad, I could still write, but the writing would sound different. I didn't always have authority in my writing, but boy, my pain sure did. So, in a way, I had a new force propelling my writing. One summer day a few years later, I realized that I couldn't do anything intricate that morning. The pain was too bad. So I wrote a blog post about my annoyance with the August task of writing and revising syllabi. I pressed post and crawled back into bed. The direct, snippy, but weirdly clear post, which I called the shadow syllabus, went viral by the time I woke up. And a decade later, it still circles around every August. This was fascinating to me because it wasn't written in the voice I associated as mine. It was Pain Woman's voice. I wrote about this and about other intersections of language and pain over the next few years in the collection Pain Woman Takes Your Keys and other essays from a nervous system. The title comes from an essay in which I imagine that while regular Sonya is trying to get around to saying something, Pain Woman has already taken your car keys and driven away. So pain itself, the experience, had gotten me unstuck from what I thought of as my writing voice and prompted me to ask myself, what did people mean when they told me and every other writer to find our voice? Was it hidden? Did we get only one? So this brought me eventually to the question of voice and how, as my experience demonstrated, one person could, it seemed, have more than one voice inside them. This isn't a new insight, but it was helpful for me as a personal experience. It was also helpful and jarring because I'd realized that my voice needed work as an essayist. I didn't sound like I had any clarity or authority because I didn't trust my own voice. And weirdly, Pain Woman had arrived to deliver it. So I started researching widely on the topic of multivocality. I read an amazing I read a lot of work by an amazing composition theorist who creative writers love with the excellent name of Peter Elbow. Read him and you'll love him. May he rest in peace. He passed away earlier this year. Elbow began writing in the 1970s that voice is complicated and can be both about the self and about society. Voice is about freedom to explore, as well as careful and focused editing and shaping. And that talking about voice, quote, can help people enjoy writing more, unquote. And that potential seems desperately important in an era in which everyone is so eager to have robots do all of our writing. Elbow writes that as kids, we play with language, including role playing and make believe, which helps us to access, quote, possible or temporary selves or dimensions of the protean self that are important and useful, but unavailable to conscious thinking and feeling. This continues into adulthood as we add layers of irony and other complications. We're playing with selves and persona all the time, and it probably isn't surprising to anyone who's listening. Elbow's writing helped me develop a weekend writing workshop in which I asked participants to write in all kinds of voices, childhood voices, teenage voices, in the voices they use to talk to their pets, their email voices, and then in the voices they imagine their lungs and spleen would have. I then explored this idea in the book Voice First, A Writer's Manifesto. And so my idea in that book is that we can be conscious about developing an ever-expanding list of our own voices, and that writing in these voices brings out perspectives, language play, and insights that might not emerge if we are focused on generating and knowing one writing voice that we think of as adult, respectable, and even as the voice that we identify as ours. The Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin described intonation as, quote, the point where language intersects with life. Bakhtin also believed in and wrote a lot about the fact that a piece of writing could have many voices, even when written by a single author. He coined the term heteroglossia to describe this. Since that time, I have often used voice as a generative engine for my own work, consciously sliding around to mix various voices, which, again, all of us as creative writers are somewhat familiar with. We all have a diversity of voices inside us. We or our students might need to assume, in connecting to the topic of this panel, that we need to imagine a character and then take on that imagined voice. But I just wanted to shift our thinking to focus on the entire palette of options that we have beyond our sense of an accent as maybe shaped by a narrow version of social identities we might occupy. All of our identities are important and they shape us and our voices, as do all of our experiences. Philip Roth wrote that voice, quote, begins around the back of the knees and reaches well above the head. In other words, voice comes from our bodies, which I think also clarifies why these experiences and why living in our individual bodies create voices that are quite complex, with histories and family trees, rather than being produced by a sense of a few personal identity markers. We live into our voices. So in some ways, this highlights all the ways in which imagining a different character with a different range of lived experience is an imaginative leap in fiction or a persona in poetry. But it also shows the ways in which we might, inside us, have experiences and voices that overlap with other body minds, and that we can draw on these to develop voices that connect to and evoke complex characters. We might sometimes think of voice as just racialized, or marked by certain divining experiences, or produced by certain regions where we live. But because voices are produced by the body in a life, we have to imagine all the facets of that body and that life. This then connects back to disability and ableism. Paisley's writing was important to me as I wrote Voice First and grappled with a chapter about the privilege that white people have in that, as she writes, quote, they do not have to struggle to separate their self-perception from pervasive negative stereotypes of them that are widely and historically held and also institutionally enforced. I was, however, and I didn't really understand this until I was reading her work, struggling to hear my voice as somehow separate from all the criticism and stereotyping I've absorbed as a non-binary person, as a disabled person, and as an activist. She also writes that white writers expect from narratives of writers of color, quote, a continuing trauma that must only be endured, never celebrated. I confront these kind of questions all the time when trying to write about disability. I have to say, in keeping with that idea that our experiences aren't just sources of trauma, that disability in the form of pain made my brain so much weirder. And weirder is so excellent. Not that it meets some bar for aesthetic product, but that it's enjoyable in and of itself because it's a new way of thinking. I'm twisted and fucked up in all sorts of new ways that have made life and writing interesting. So this gets back to embodied voices. Through the lens of disability, as the most equal opportunity challenge that anyone can fall into at any time, I want to ask you to ask yourself, are you sure you're not disabled? Rather than imagining what it's like to move through the world as someone with a particular disability, if you don't have one, I'd like you to come at it from a different angle. What's it really like to be you with that weirdness you've never written about? The imprint or issue that you know you don't want to deal with, but that makes you not a perfectly abstract brain in a jar. There's so much to unpack, and it will make you emotional. And then it will literally upend your feelings about yourself. And then it will ask you to rebuild your sense of yourself as a body. And that's an intense, but also freaking fascinating and irreplaceable experience. I think sometimes we're drawn to explore and maybe appropriate or inhabit other identities because imagining those other lives is a break from our own, which get a little bit complicated. Almost no one wants to be in their own skin these days, especially if that skin and those identities are being targeted by the Trump administration, and so many of us are. I'm inviting us all then to use what we have inside of us to first understand the truly physical and multiple idea of voices, including the voices we use in writing, and then to play with those voices stretching them out and feeling their ranges, and then letting that understanding of voice animate what you're inspired to write. It's complex, but also it's fun, and we desperately need it too. It's a reminder of all we are in the face of all that wants us to not be. Thanks so much, and wishing you a great rest of your day.